to, but I will let our presenter take it away, the Reverend Brian Henderson.
Thank you, Alice, and it is good to be with everyone. My other Walter Rowell story, I shared the Barbara story earlier. The other Walter Rowell story happened on an adventure with Anne, an early adventure with Anne. We went snow tubing up in Winter Park, and Anna and I went. It was a daddy-daughter date. And the last thing I was told before leaving the house was, whatever you do, don't let Anna get away from you at all. And so Anna and I are going up the magic carpet. And as we're going with our tubes, and we just went through a whole safety session of what to do and what not to do. Talk about scaring you, Alice. They scared us going up the hill just to go snow tubing. But we're going up the magic carpet, and Anna says, Dad, I'm going to go down all by myself. And I said, no, I can't let you go by yourself. And she said, no, I can do it. So long story short, we get to the top, and it was a pivotal moment for me. I had my hands on her tube, and I kind of checked everything out, and I thought, okay, I think she can do it. I think she can get down. There wasn't anyone else on the hill at that point, and I let her go. And as I let her go, I felt this hand on my shoulder. And I turned around, and it was Walter Rowell. He said, Brian, get used to doing what you just did, because you're going to do that for the rest of your life. And Walter, I thought of you last November when I went with Anna, and she passed her driver's test. And she's now. Yeah. And this time next year, we will be sending her off to university, which is like, how does this happen? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can ride a magic carpet and go down a hill on a snow tube, but I don't know how good I am at navigating PowerPoint and Zoom. So I think what I want to do is share my screen like that, and then I'm going to do this. And now I think you can see my computer screen. And I'm going to bring this up, and I'm going to say play from start. So does it look like you see something on your screen now?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right, it's working. It's working. The sound system in the sanctuary on a Sunday morning doesn't work, but perhaps Zoom and PowerPoint will work for us tonight. So good. So again, thank you to Anne, Alice, and Morgan for the opportunity to participate in your summer series, Free to Be, an exploration of Baptist identity, freedoms, ordinances, and associations. I'll share personally, Calvary Baptist Church is a special community of people, family and friends, especially to our Henderson family. And I believe I know all of you on the screen tonight in a personal way, so thank you. Thank you too to Bill Warren for trading weeks with me. Technically, I suppose that tonight's session might be more accurately titled Part 2, as Bill offered what he did last week. But to get started, I'd like to walk us through a series of PowerPoint slides and then take time to engage each other in questions and/or conversation as time permits before we hand things back over to Alice and to Anne. Now, see, now I've got to figure out how to do this. I've got to, do I click on the arrow? There we go. Good. By way of review, from what you have covered, I suspect in this summer series, and from what you have each probably learned over the years, Walter Sheridan summarizes our Baptist identity by writing about our 4 fragile freedoms. Bible freedom, we are free to interpret the Bible for ourselves and to find meaning from our sacred texts. Soul freedom, each person can connect with God directly. There's no need for anyone else to do this on one's behalf. Church freedom, each local congregation can determine for itself its sense of ministry to its community. And religious freedom, all faiths are free to be what they are, and we can honor faiths different from our own. Someone once commented to me after reviewing these freedoms, why wouldn't anyone want to be a Baptist, Brian? This sounds pretty freeing if you ask me. So when we speak of church freedom, we often use the term, as I suspect many of you know, we use the term autonomy. Each Baptist congregation is to be autonomous. It can function on its own without anyone or anybody dictating to it what it can and cannot do. While Baptists uphold our autonomy, we do recognize the wisdom and strength in being in association with others. I like to say that our autonomy is our greatest strength as American Baptists, and it's also our greatest challenge. Now, an overview of American Baptist churches, which is what I think Morgan originally tasked me with providing for tonight's session or for this session. There is significance in our name, American Baptist Churches, USA. We are uniquely influenced by our American culture. We are Baptist, or we strive to be as Baptist as we can be, and we are made up of a body of churches, plural. We're not the American Baptist Church, singular. Our name reminds us that we work independently and yet interdependently too. The stories of John Smythe or John Smith and Roger Williams are significant. They are our Baptist forebears, but it is to be noted, interestingly, that neither of them remained a Baptist. John Smythe became a Mennonite at the end of his life, and Roger Williams returned to being a Congregationalist. Perhaps this is why, to this day, it can be a challenge for us as American Baptists to have a sense of our identity. Even our forebears wrestled with the radical nature of what it can mean to be Baptist. On this timeline, you can see that American Baptist Churches USA traces its origin to 1906. In some ways, I know that many of you know already much about our American Baptist life. And so in some ways, I'm probably speaking or preaching to the choir. And you know a lot about our connections too. So forgive me if some of this information is redundant. In general, though, it's helpful to think of our larger denominational family and connections in terms of a larger umbrella or tent under which the offices of the General Secretary, the Ministers and Missionaries Benefits Board, International Ministries, American Baptist Home Mission Societies, regional ministries, and congregational ministry function together. The Board of General Ministries is the board of people with a president, a vice president, a budget officer, and a past president, along with about 35 other representatives from throughout the denomination that provides oversight and leadership to the General Secretary's offices. They are, if you will, the board that represents our denomination. Calvary can be proud knowing that your former senior pastor and now pastor emerita, Mary Holst, once served as vice president, president, and past president of the denomination. And when president, Mary led our denominational family through a significant and stressful time of great organizational and institutional change. Mary's stable and steady leadership, even as she was stably and steadily leading Calvary for so many years, her leadership helped our American Baptist organizations accomplish substantial work, all while experiencing significant change. Our national offices are located in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, as well as in New York City. The General Secretary's offices, American Baptist Home Mission Society, as well as International Ministries are all in Valley Forge, and the Ministers and Missionaries Benefits Board is in New York City. Because of the nature of their work, it's better for them to be near a financial center such as New York. Jeff Woods is our interim General Secretary, and as such, Jeff serves as the organizational executive for American Baptist, as well as our pastoral leader. MMBB, for short, provides retirement services to ministers and missionaries, as well as a host of other services and ministries. Its mission from its inception in the early 1900s is to promote the interest in the maintenance of the ministry. And I know that Calvary has several retired ministers and missionaries that are part of its larger church community, as does First Baptist and many other churches here in the greater Denver area. And we can all be grateful for the work of MMBB. International Ministries is no stranger to Calvary. IM's previous executive director was on staff at Calvary, Reed Trulson, along with Janelle, the woman to whom he's married. IM's mission is largely based on the philosophy of working cross-culturally, always in partnership with other Baptist and faith-based bodies worldwide. American Baptist Home Mission Societies provides ministry and resources to American Baptists and many others throughout the United States and Puerto Rico. Perhaps our denominational name, ABC USA, should be ABC USA PR, or American Baptist Churches USA and Puerto Rico. We forget that a large part of our American Baptist family serves and lives in Puerto Rico. There are other organizations related to our American Baptist family that provide various types of ministry. These organizations presented are but a sampling. Now, by the numbers, approximately this is, I should say, how American Baptists shape up. We are the only, and this is interesting, we are the only ethnic non-majority denomination in the United States, which means that there isn't one ethnic or cultural group of people that is the largest or that is larger than, that is greater than 50% of our constituents. From our national boards and organizations, we are also then organized, it's good to know, regionally by regions of churches. And as we can see in these statistics, we currently have 34 American Baptist regions. Calvary currently is a part of, as you know, the American Baptist Churches of the Rocky Mountains region, of which Bill Warren is past president. First Baptist Church Denver, where I now serve, is a member of the Evergreen Association. And of course, within each region, we have many local congregations. When I was first starting out in American Baptist life and ministry, I was reminded by several individuals of the phrase, the local church is the fundamental unit of mission within our American Baptist family. Now, I'm going to see if I can do this correctly. Let's see. It's just kind of a recap of the denominational mission boards and organizations that are part of who we are and that we've already kind of looked at and highlighted tonight. There's a punchline coming though. Here it comes. There is far more we can do together than any of us can do on our own. When we think about our American Baptist family, we are divided by organizations nationally. We are organized and are divided regionally. But I think it's always helpful for us to have a sense of how all of the individual groups and organizations and mission boards and parts and congregations and regions of our Baptist family, when we all come together, the reality is there is far more we can do together. Now, American Baptists have struggled with unity on any number of social and theological realities over the decades. Our current identity statements, plural, reflect this struggle or tension. It is a challenge to be Baptist and be committed to our Baptist freedoms, isn't it? I present us with some excerpts of our current identity statements. In a few moments, I'm going to give you a link to a website where you can, if you wanted to, read our identity statements in total. But for right now, I want us to just look at some excerpts. The first one is from 1998, as you can see. It is one that I believe really speaks to the heart of what it means to be American Baptist. The second one, with a slight modification, I suppose, speaks as well to what it means to be a Baptist family that will wrestle with our freedoms. It, as it is noted, is from 2005. However, in 2005, a fourth bullet was added to the section titled A Biblical People. Can you see it? In 2005, this fourth bullet was added. A biblical people who submit to the teaching of Scripture that God's design for sexual intimacy places it within the context of marriage between one man and one woman, and acknowledge that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with biblical teaching. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to get off on a tangent tonight, but I share this to highlight the fact of how much of a struggle it can be to be a Baptist family, and particularly to be an American Baptist family. Now, in truth, there was and is still lots of politics behind these two statements. And there are groups like AWAB and others that are asking currently our interim general secretary to essentially decide on using only one identity statement. It's very confusing when you have two identical identity statements, and yet there's a slight difference between the two of them with this fourth bullet. Fortunately, the section titled An Inclusive People really reflects what it can mean to fully live into and out of our four fragile freedoms. And under an inclusive people, our identity statements both together communicate that we are an inclusive people who are gifted by a variety of backgrounds. We find unity in diversity and diversity in unity. We are an inclusive people who embrace a pluralism of race, ethnicity, and gender. And we are an inclusive people who acknowledge that there are individual differences of conviction and theology. If you ask me, these three bullets really do kind of emphasize what it means to be American Baptist and what it means more specifically to be Baptist. Now, most of you probably know this website and you maybe have been there to visit it, abcusa.org. I'd invite you, I'd encourage you to go check it out if you haven't. There's lots of information there. Some of the ABC USA website is not very intuitive, so you have to kind of dig around a little bit to find things. But I would encourage you to check it out. I'd like to conclude by citing a 19th century Baptist pastor and theologian, as well as a 21st century Baptist scholar and historian, before leaving you with some questions. Pardon the archaic language, but I find this quote by John Clifford to be helpful and inspiring. Living men differ. It is the dead who agree, poor shattered fragments that we are. Why truth would have no chance at all on earth if each man were nothing but a sibilant echo of his fellow. God sets men at different angles to the truth, so that one may see what others cannot, and thereby more of her virginal beauty and perennial loveliness revealed. Pluck the fruits of controversy from the New Testament tree, and you have not only stripped it of its most precious growths, but left the branches so bare that they cease to be a sheltering home for the wearied nations of the earth. Dissent, as Bill Leonard notes in that quote at the bottom of the screen, is in fact one of our Baptist ways of being. As Calvary continues the effective and meaningful ministry it does, I leave you with these questions. As a Baptist community, how then shall you yet be? What ways will you continue to live out the radical, freeing nature of our Baptist heritage as you share the good news of Jesus? How might Calvary be part of the larger mission and ministry of our American Baptist denomination? So I know that's a lot of information and some of it may have seemed clunky. I I hope it was somewhat helpful, and I hope I did somewhat of what Morgan asked me to do. But I'd be willing and eager to see if there are any questions or comments or reflections that anyone has.
Brian, you might want to put those questions in the chat for everyone to see.
Okay.
Because it might be some good discussion there with those questions. And I immediately forgot them as well. So
no worries.
My memory is terrible. But Christine, did you have a question?
I do. On the clause about autonomy.
Yeah.
Is it my understanding that each individual church cannot be told who they can and cannot ordain, or?
That's a good question, Christine. And that is a question that is answered probably differently in every region. Some regions will be similar and other regions will have a different approach. And so, I mean, again, to be Baptist, fundamentally, the local congregation has the final say in what it does and what it doesn't do, and who it ordains and who it doesn't ordain. And here's where it gets tricky for us as American Baptists, because we function within a regional and national system, if you will. And I earlier on, I did say that we strive, while we are autonomous, we strive to be in association with others. And here's it's challenging. Associations, somewhat by by no fault of their own, develop a voice of their own, if you will, and a collective voice. And somehow or another, they can tend to hold sway and influence over what a local congregation can do, to the point where a local congregation can be told, if you do this, which is not in agreement with what we at the larger associational level think or believe, we may not let you be a member of us any longer. And that's where it gets really tricky. And
we were told that once.
Yeah. As was First Baptist, and the reality is there are. I think I can authentically say there's hundreds of churches around our denominational family that have had that experience, and it's tough. Yeah. And at one level, I want to say to regional leaders, let's remember what it means to be Baptist, and yet it's tricky. And so to be Baptist is to hold up our autonomy. Remember, I said our autonomy is our greatest strength, and yet it's also our greatest challenge. And so the challenge is to find ways of being able to do collectively mission together, while letting our local churches make decisions about ministry on their own. I was in a meeting a couple of years ago, and I was invited as a representative of AWAB to speak to an executive committee of a region. And the region was about to disfellowship 2 churches that were welcoming and affirming. And in the course of conversation, and I have to say, it was a very civil conversation and it had a good outcome. But in the course of conversation, someone said to me, Brian, aren't all AWAB churches alike? And don't they all want us to just think the way that they think? And I listened and I said, actually, in all honesty, I can name for you 10 different AWAB congregations. And I bet you, because they're Baptists, the 10 that I would name wouldn't get along with each other, because there are any number of other things other than human sexuality that they will disagree on. And the person was quite shocked and stunned to think that, oh, I didn't realize that. And so to be Baptist is to be different, honestly. And our work is to figure out how to be different and yet how to trust and get along with each other. And I thought you were going to make a comment.
Yeah, I just had a question because you're in a unique position. I know for myself, Calvary was my first American Baptist Church experience. And so therefore, American Baptist Churches of the Rocky Mountains is my only regional experience. But you have been an American Baptist for a long time. You've been in multiple different regions, like Philadelphia, or the area you were before, and then Rocky Mountains when you were at Calvary, now Evergreen Association. Do you mind just kind of highlighting how you've seen, I don't know exactly how to ask this, but what are some of the differences in how regions operate that you've noticed, or maybe strengths or weaknesses? Because I know when I talk to colleagues around the country, sometimes I'm shocked about like what their regions do and how different it is than our region, like how different they can all be. That's a broad question, so take it wherever you want. But
Oh, no, thank you. On the timeline that I shared earlier, I'm trying to see if I can find the timeline. In 17, I want to make sure I get the dates correct.
the Philadelphia
Yeah,
conference,
1707, I believe.
1706 maybe? Or?
So 1706, the Philadelphia Association was formed. That was the first formal Baptist association in the on the continent, if you will. And so I came from the Philadelphia area and was connected to the Philadelphia Baptist Association. And then was a part of, as well as I was a part of the American Baptist Churches of Pennsylvania and Delaware. And APCOPAD still is organized regionally in an associational, with an associational model. So there's the region, and then within the region, I don't remember exactly at this point in time, but I want to say within the region, there were 22 associations. So APCOPAD, much bigger than the Rocky Mountains region, encompassed 2 states. Pennsylvania is a pretty big state. And so it had several hundred churches. And all of those churches were then organized by local associations. And so each local association had its own ordination council. And then the association reported back to the region. And so there were more layers of organization. Whereas out here in the Rocky Mountains region, we don't have associations, we have a region. And the churches all kind of gather together around the annual meeting where business is conducted and decisions are made and whatnot. And then there's the region board. So there's less, I would say there are less people involved in a region such as Rocky Mountains compared to APCOPAD that has an associational model. And you know, so there is a difference. Every region is unique. Some regions kind of tend to function more top down. Other regions try to function as best as they can, leaving as much authority and power and decision-making abilities with the local church. But it's human nature, isn't it? We get afraid of what we're afraid of. And then the way that we handle our fear is by creating a system of control so that we can determine what can be and what can't be. And again, you know, to be Baptist is radical. To be Baptist, contrary to what people think, is to free us from all of this kind of organized stuff so that we can, as effectively as we can, empower individuals in local faith communities to share the good news of Jesus. And you know, we will forever struggle to be Baptist. And sometimes folk can get fed up with that. I understand that. I get that. Maybe that's why John Smythe became a Mennonite. Maybe that's why Roger Wilkins decided to go back to being a Congregationalist, because to be Baptist is hard. And yet it's in the hard work of allowing individuals and communities to be free that I think potentially that sense of the Spirit, that sense of divine love, that sense of allowing someone to become completely and fully who she, he, or they are can take place.
I'm reminded of a saying of Larry Lowhead's. Actually, with Larry and Betty, we're a tag team, because Larry would say, every Baptist is free to go to hell in his own way. And Betty would say, no, that's heaven, dear.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. That's a theological conversation for another time that I wish Larry Lowhead was still around for. Bill.
Yes, when I was preparing for last week's session, I was looking at the ABCRM, the region website, and I noted that there was a requirement to sign off on this thing called a covenant and code of ethics. I think that was the name. And perhaps Brian and Ann and perhaps Pastor Alice has signed this thing. I don't know. But so I wanted to find it and see what it said. And I went out and Googled, something on the order of American Baptist Covenant and Code of Ethics. And guess what? Every region had a different one. And I opened, I don't know, 5 or 10 of them, and they were all different. I couldn't believe how different they were. And it just tells you how all over the place this is.
Yeah, no, for sure. At the national level, there is an organization called the Ministers' Council. And the Ministers' Council does have a code of ethics that it has been the keeper and the custodian of for years. And currently, the National Code of Ethics is under review and is being revised. And in good Baptist fashion, there is debate around regions around the country as to what should and shouldn't be in this Code of Ethics. And so now the conversation is evolving to the place where people are beginning to say, you know what, maybe we can use the National Code of Ethics as a guide, but we should adapt it to our own regional families, because there are things regionally that we've got convictions regionally that are different than convictions nationally. So the Code of Ethics is something that is under conversation and debate and discussion. And honestly, 10, 20 years from now, we'll have another series like this, and it'll still be under discussion and debate. For the record, though, I don't know, Ann, when you came to ABCRM, did you have to sign the Code of Ethics?
I had to sign it, and I had to go through my whole ordination process all over again.
I know, I didn't mean to take
David Dallas.
I didn't mean to pull that scab off, sorry.
That's okay.
But for the record, I am getting old enough now, and I just passed I'm into my 22nd year as an American Baptist pastor. And for the record, I have never signed the Code of Ethics. Interestingly,
You should have seen it. Before I signed it, I sent it back to Steve with 30 comments and questions saying, can you clarify what this means?
he sent me your
Right.
But seriously, for me, honestly, that's where my own sense of being a Baptist, being a radical, comes into play. I'm not going to sign a code that I can't completely agree with.
Right.
And there, it gets a little bit touchy, because there are ordinands around the country who, when they get to that place, struggle with, I don't know if I can sign this. And what happens is most folks just wind up signing it because they just want to, check that off the list, just so that they can get to the next part of the process, which, I don't know, kind of defeats the purpose of what it means to be a Baptist and to do what we do.
Yeah.
Well, and when I part of my getting called and coming to Calvary was the understanding that I would have my ordination recognized by ABC, since I was an American Baptist. So I know I felt a loyalty to Calvary. They asked me to do this process. I'm supposed to do this process. I went through all the papers and all the interviews and stuff. And, I think much more different about ethics now, even than when I first came at age 27 to Calvary. But I remember writing my home pastor, George, in Dallas, and being like, I didn't have to do this for my first, and sending it to him. And I had all these questions about it. So it was a weird feeling signing a document of any, even though Code of Ethics to me is a little bit different than what you call doctrine of belief, because it was more about my personal behavior than having to claim something I believe. But still, it was sort of weird to me. But I also understand the need for it, so.
Now, I know that Calvary is in the discernment process right now of speaking about being Baptist and being a part of a larger family and association and being in covenant with others. I know that Calvary, under Ann's leadership, is in the process of discerning whether it will continue within the Rocky Mountains region or whether it might consider another region. And I think I might be a part of that region that you might be considering. So I say all of this carefully, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying anything. I don't want to cross any inappropriate lines, but I will say this, and this isn't, and I don't mean to discourage anyone from thinking about what you are discerning, but just remember this. Whether you remain with the Rocky Mountains region or whether you become part of another region, you are going to continue to be part of a community of American Baptists. And wherever there are American Baptists, there will be different ideas and perspectives and challenges that will need to be processed. So saying that, I will say the Evergreen Association has been a wonderful home to be for First Baptist and for my family. So.
I just want to make a comment that, and Bill, you may have touched on this last week. I have not watched your recording yet. I apologize. But when you talk about regions, I think it's really striking to me how different, how challenging it is for our regional execs and boards. If you think about a region like Chicago that's in a city, pretty much if you're in the city of Chicago, you have similar like issues and things that you're dealing with and similar sometimes church sizes and whatnot versus like a region like Rocky Mountains where you have a lot of rural churches in Wyoming that are so different than say First Baptist Denver or Calvary here in Denver. And so when we're at these regional gatherings, when I sit at a table and listen to the challenges of pastors in Wyoming or more rural Colorado, it's a lot for regions to sort of have to meet and meet the needs and pastor to the pastors of all these different kinds of places. So sometimes I envy the regions that are a lot like more
Homogenous.
Yeah, I mean, even in not necessarily in theology, but in context and in setting, only because, not because we all think alike, but because there's similar programmatic needs or missional needs, when you're in a city than say when you're in the country. It's just the way it is. So.
Yeah.
I will say, having been around American Baptist churches now for almost 30 years, and speaking of regions and regional executive ministers even, what gives me hope, and I don't mean or intend to disrespect or disparage the ministry of those that have gone before us, who have held executive minister positions. However, there was a point in time when the executive ministers of our denomination, it was kind of like the old boys club, and perhaps even the old white boys club, so to speak. And they tended to have similar theological perspectives and views. However, having been a part of our denominational family now for almost 3 decades, what's hopeful for me is to see the turnover in executive ministers across the country. We have a crop of younger executive ministers who have theologically and socially different perspectives and convictions than those who have gone before us. And while there will still be some, and even some younger folk, that will see things quite differently than, say, Calvary Baptist or First Baptist or Pine Street Church in Boulder, in general, the perspective, the attitude, the openness continues to become more inclusive and affirming on any number of realities and challenges. So for me, I look ahead for our American Baptist family and see great hope because we've got new leaders who are coming along, who are challenging congregations and challenging associations and challenging regions to be more Baptist.
There's another reason for hope, at least in my mind, and that's the fact that because of the championing of autonomy within the American Baptist organization, it makes this play out a little differently than, say, what just happened in the Methodist Church, because the Methodist Church is an extremely top-down organization in pretty much every level. Yet the same kind of thing happened to them, and it was a crisis, and nobody in the organization knew how to deal with just pure disagreement. We're kind of used to it, you know? So there's reason for hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the quote, living men or living people differ. It's the dead who agree.
I like that one too.
When we all get to heaven,
Yes.
what a day joy it will be.
Lori Burke had her hand up.
Lori.
Yeah, I just wonder about the history or why there are 34 regions.
Mhm.
I mean, it seems so, I guess I'm confused that, you know, some of the regions seem to be more or less geographic, and then others seem to have just popped up. You know, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so largely, most of our American Baptist regions are regional. And they were organized because they were they represented a state, or they represented, in the case of some smaller states, Pennsylvania and Delaware was small enough that it connected with Pennsylvania. And so at one level, Lori, you're exactly right. Most regions organized by virtue of their geography. And there was a point in time when, if you were going to be an American Baptist church, you needed to associate with the region in your geographical location. But then, about 25, 30 years ago, there were about 8 American Baptist congregations that came out as being welcoming and affirming. And as a result of that, were disfellowshipped from their regions. And all of a sudden, these churches were without a region. And technically, by American Baptist Churches USA bylaws, in order to be American Baptist, you have to be a part of a region. And so all of a sudden, these churches, who were, most of them honestly, were historic American Baptist congregations, were all of a sudden left out. And so at that point in time, the way that, and it took some bylaw gymnastics, to be honest, to make this work. But what those 8 churches did, actually 12 churches, excuse me, what those 12 churches did is they found regions that would welcome them. So we had a couple of churches in California that joined a region in New York. We had one church in California, First Baptist of Berkeley, that joined the Wisconsin region. And so what began happening a quarter of a century ago was kind of an evolution of how American Baptists relate to each other regionally and nationally. And so, again, about a quarter of a century ago, Evergreen Association was birthed, and largely because Evergreen was realizing that there were a number of churches that were being pushed out. And so it was formed to be a place, a region, if you will, in which or to which churches could go that otherwise might not find a home in more conservative regions. So, there has been a shift over the last quarter of a century from strictly being geographically based to now being kind of connected to each other more in terms of ministry philosophy and principle and convictions.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nancy.
Is there a significant difference in meaning between association as in Evergreen or region as in Rocky Mountain?
So I think, and I'm not an Evergreen Association historian, but I suspect that the use of the term association, Evergreen Association, was to kind of downplay some of the geographical association, not to use the word twice, that the denomination has had over the years. So, and associationally, you know, we, again, using some of our Baptist language and vernacular, we work locally, autonomously, and yet we want to associate with other Baptists to do mission together. So I suspect the use of the term was to kind of take a step away from the more geographically oriented way of thinking about things.
Daniel had his hand up.
Daniel.
Yeah.
There.
Thank you, Brian. That's really been a good overview of a lot of different pieces. I was going to add, in response to the question, how did these regions come about? One thing to keep in mind is a lot of these have evolved and changed over time. ABCRM has not always been ABCRM. We've only been ABCRM since 1972. Prior to that, it was the Colorado Baptist Association and the Wyoming Baptist Association. And legally, it still is. If you go to a business meeting, the very last thing that we do is we say all of the decisions made by the American Baptist Churches of the Rocky Mountains shall also be the decisions of the Colorado Baptist Association. Do you vote aye or nay? And then we do it again so we do it for both Wyoming and Colorado. So these things change and evolve over time. It's interesting history, really.
Dan, thanks for your comment about Evergreen. And again, I'm not an Evergreen historian, but I think those who were around when it began, yes, it kind of suggests maybe somewhat of a geographical location or identity, but it also, I think, was intended to be a symbol of new birth too.
Okay, yeah, I just don't think of Florida when I hear Evergreen. Yeah, they would have called themselves the Everglades Association. But the other thing that's interesting, Brian, though, is you talk about this. I remember back in the 90s when we were having all these discussions about, oh my God, you can't let a region, a church switch from one region to the other because that undermines the autonomy of the region that disfellowshipped them. And it was a big scandal that we were allowing churches to do that. And there was a lot of anger at the national offices for, and it might not have even been the national office that had anything to do with that. I don't know. But what's interesting is years later, when First Baptist left, or other churches that I'm familiar with in other regions, it was kind of okay, we'll voluntarily leave and the region will voluntarily and happily vote you out so that we don't have to fight about this. And it kind of became an acceptable workaround to separate churches and regions that were at odds with each other, whereas it originated as something that was just horribly scandalous, and now we all kind of accept it. So
to be Baptist can bring out our darker angels, but to be Baptist, we can also see our brighter and better angels come out too. I want to be sensitive to time. I know it's 7:30. And so I want to thank everyone again for listening to me and allowing me to ramble on as I did. I hope it was somewhat helpful.
Oh, thank you,
And
Brian.
grateful to each of you.
For being here.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Really,
Thank you so much, Brian.
absolutely.
Really good to have your perspective because you've been involved with ABC for so long and in so many different ways. And so I know I speak on behalf of all of us that we're very grateful for your service and volunteer hours and heart and sweat and tears that you give to our denomination on the national level, regional level, and also at First Baptist. So we're very grateful.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Right?
Thank you, Alice.
So is this when the happy hour begins?
Yes.
I heard something about that.
Thank you so much, Brian.
All
Yeah,
right.
thanks,
It was-
Brian.
Nice to
Brian?
see you, Brian.
Brian, I know you can't see me because somehow or other,
I hear you,
Hi.
Judy.
But it's nice to see you.
Wonderful.
I miss you popping into Calvary every once in a while.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you. And Christine, I don't know if everyone knows it, but Christine and I are arch rivals
Yes.
when it comes to words with friends. So
We
Christine-
play that game every day.
I don't think Christine sleeps. I think she's.
She doesn't.
Believe that.
I want to win that game just once against him. He's very smart.
Oh my. Very good. All right.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.